Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to have you here at UNI, and really appreciate you coming out tonight. This is a special event for us. This is part of our Restoration and Management Seminar series, and this is the second of three talks. And I am wanted to just say a couple things. We are here because this seminar series is supported by the Friends of the Tallgrass Prairie Center, and we're very grateful for their financial support. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kurt Meine. Kurt is a conservation biologist, an environmental historian, and a writer. He serves as senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and with the Chicago-based Center for Humans and Nature, and also has close association with the International Crane Foundation, which is right next to the Aldo Leopold Foundation. Meine received his BA in English and History from DePaul University in Chicago, and his MS and PhD in Land Resources from the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And his dissertation became the first published biography of Aldo Leopold, which won many awards. Over the years, Meine has worked with a wide array of nonprofit organizations, agencies, universities, and businesses, including the National Academy of Sciences and the International Crane Foundation, where he worked with colleagues around the world to develop the first global conservation action plan for cranes, and I mean the birds, not the machines. In addition to his Leopold biography, Meine has written and edited a number of books on conservation and environmental history, including Wallace Stegner and the Continental Vision, Correction Lines, Essays on Land, Leopold, and Conservation, 2004, and the bioregional anthology, The Driftless Reader, 2017. Meine also served as narrator and on-screen guide for the Emmy Award-winning documentary film Green Fire, Aldo Leopold, and why do I choke up when I talk about Green Fire? We know why. And a land ethic for our time. Please join me in welcoming Kurt Meine.
Thank you. We're going to do a little tech prep here so that you all can hear me in the room and all the folks out there in Zoom land can hear me. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Let me do this. And clicker.
That's right.
And the cover for the clicker. There we go. All right. Thank you, Laura.
Should switch to.
Oh, yeah, I got to do that. I'll do that. So thank you all for coming. And I'll get my slides up here. And a special thanks to Laura for inviting me. Not only inviting, what happened to my slides? There they are here. There they are. Okay. For inviting me, not only inviting me, but then giving me a tour of the Tallgrass Prairie Center, which I have never been to after all these years of working on prairies and working in the same circles as Laura, but sometimes it takes an extra effort and invitation. And I'm so inspired by just spending 1 hour down the road at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, and I already want to go back home and get all my friends to come over here and visit. So thank you, Laura. Thank you all for coming. Special thanks to Wes Jackson and Joan and Kamiar. Where are you, Kamiar? He had to go for providing the logistics to bring Wes and Joan here to Cedar Falls. So I'm going to launch into this. Why real fast? Because I forgot my notes at home. But I've done this, I hope, enough that I don't need them and that we'll be able to enjoy the story of Paul Johnson, Aldo Leopold, the connections that have been forged over decades and that are still with us. I'm going to start out actually by saying I know there's a few people my age-ish are in here. How many knew Paul Johnson? All right, half a dozen folks who knew Paul. So I especially would invite you to say a few words if you'd like during the Q&A if we have time, because this really is about a community of people that Paul was a part of here in Iowa, especially but beyond that, nationally. And it was a community that Paul both helped create and represented and benefited from in his work. And the occasion for doing this is this new publication of his writings that I've been working on for the last 4 or 5 years, actually. Paul passed away in February of 2021. We were in the tail end of COVID lockdown, and Paul had been working quite hard to try to put a book together. He always wanted to do a book, and he was never quite able to do it because he was not a writer per se. He liked to write and he wrote a lot, but he was an active citizen and farmer. He was a man of action as much as he was of words. And so he and I talked a lot about this. In fact, in his later years, we talked a lot about what he was writing. He would send me drafts. I would read them and give him suggestions. But we lost him in February 2021, and I sort of took it on as my task to complete a book of Paul's. And I'll tell you more about him as we go along for those of you who didn't know him. But it is available. We have a few copies outside, and I'm happy to say it was published by Ice Cube Press out of Iowa City. You're very lucky here in Iowa to have this wonderful independent press down there publishing some really wonderful volumes. So I highly recommend Ice Cube Press to you all. And maybe before I click that cover photo, there's a whole story. I won't go into it all about that cover photo. But it was taken actually by a photographer on assignment for National Geographic in 1978. And we were trying to track down this photographer, trying to see if he's still alive, frankly. Turned out he was still alive because we wanted to use a photograph that he took that was in a book that the National Geographic published. But we couldn't get permission to use that photo. So we contacted the photographer. He says, well, I have a bunch of other photos from that shoot. We ended up with this one, and I love this photo because it really captures Paul and with his favorite breed, right? Jerseys coming out of the barn. He's got a white shirt on. So I don't know, maybe he's going to a meeting. Maybe he's going back to have some official business done, but this captures Paul and that kind of attitude of also looking down to the ground with his hand on the animal. And that's just the connections that he was so devoted to. Plants, animals, soil, water, society. It's Paul. But my talk tonight is going to be specifically, it's kind of a variation on the theme of talking about Paul Johnson and Aldo Leopold and the important connections between them, and especially here in Iowa. This is so important to talk about, and it's so important to talk about now. I live over in Wisconsin, and I am reading headlines every day about what's going on in Iowa, particularly what's going on with water quality, cancer rates. It's an election year, so it's in the news, and it's not important just for Iowa. What's happening here is important for what goes on nationally. Iowa is always a proving ground for important issues that have national significance. That'll come up again a little bit later. But the intersection of Paul Johnson from Decorah, Iowa, and Aldo Leopold from Madison, Wisconsin, actually, this is the landscape in a sense of their intersection. This is Coon Valley, Wisconsin. I won't say too much about it right now, but I wanted to set that scene for you. This is just outside La Crosse, Wisconsin, just upstream from the Mississippi River, outside of Coon Valley, Wisconsin, this scene. And I'll say more about it in a little while, but the significance of this is the first watershed scale soil conservation demonstration project in the country, starting in 1933. And Paul knew the story of this place and shared it nationally. Leopold was involved in this in 1933. And of all the things I could say about this place in this photo, the most important thing is this was one of the earliest examples of what we now call community-based conservation. This was 500 farmers collaborating to restore this what was then a badly degraded watershed. I'm going to leave it at that for now because we'll come back to that. As I was putting this together, I began to notice these parallels between Paul and Aldo Leopold. And even the images that almost echo each other, right? This is Paul in his later years when he was working away at writing. This is Aldo Leopold. For those of you who don't know Leopold, of course, he was one of the most influential conservationists of the 20th century, arguably the most influential. This captures him in his later years when he was himself beginning to think about writing more. So this parallel of their lives is fascinating to me. They both, toward the end of their lives, began to think, I need to write more for the general public, not just for those who share my particular disciplinary interest or professional interest. They shared a passion for conservation in this Midwestern landscape, which of course is largely private lands in the hands of farmers. And they shared a devotion to thinking about the conservation of private lands, not just the public lands we celebrate and love. And that has been the focus of so much work in environmental history on why the national parks and national wildlife refuges and forests. Leopold took a turn in his life toward thinking more about private lands. Just a quote from his essay, The Land Ethic. There's a clear tendency in American conservation to relegate to government all necessary jobs that private landowners fail to perform. But at what point will governmental conservation, like the mastodon, become handicapped by its own dimensions? The answer, if there is any, seems to be in a land ethic or some other force that assigns more obligation to the private landowner. Paul, when he served as chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I'll get to that, published this document, official USDA document, making an argument for greater attention to private lands. Paul's words, today we understand that narrowly circumscribed areas of natural beauty and protected land alone can't provide the quality of environment people need and want. We must also recognize the needs of America's private land and private landowners for us to truly have a geography of hope. And that phrase, by the way, for those who don't know where it might come from, a geography of hope, that's a phrase of another Iowa native son. Those are the words of Wallace Stegner in the early 60s. Both were men of action and work as much as they were of ideas and words. So I just love these parallels. I wasn't looking for them, but as I was sorting through photos, I began to notice that they were both devoted to these same efforts. In this case, planting pines in the same counties of Wisconsin and planting Christmas trees outside Decorah, Iowa. Both in their early years worked for the Forest Service. Paul's tenure was pretty brief. He had a couple field seasons working with the U.S. Forest Service out west. Leopold spent the first half of his career out west in national forests in Arizona and New Mexico. So we'll get more into kind of the substance of their connection, but I want to give you a little bit of background on Paul Johnson, this fellow who I think I can make a very good argument he was the most important conservationist of the last 2 generations, particularly because of that devotion to private lands, which are 70% of the American land base. And Paul took that fact seriously and devoted himself to bringing concepts of a land ethic to the people of this country. So a little bit of biographical background on Paul. He was actually born in Oakland in 1941, the outset of World War II. He spent a lot of his boyhood, his first 15 years, in the Midwest, bouncing between the Chicago area and his farms he worked on in South Dakota, actually. His father was a preacher and had a church assignment in South Dakota. So Paul grew up actually in South Dakota, but again, had family scattered through Wisconsin, Chicago, and was very much influenced by his landscapes in Chicago and other parts of the Midwest. And I'm going to jump ahead here. Paul's was a life of public service. And this has become, even since the book was published, this has become more important to talk about. Paul was devoted early. Why do I show this photo to introduce this theme? So early on, before he became interested in conservation, Paul's professional vision for himself was to become an aeronautical engineer. So he was a student at Champaign-Urbana, University of Illinois, studying aeronautical engineering, but he was working at the airport in Champaign-Urbana. That's him on the right there. 1962, well, 2 years before when he was still working at the airport, he welcomed into the airport in Champaign-Urbana the campaign plane of John F. Kennedy running for president. He brought the plane into the terminal. Kennedy was there to speak during the campaign in 1960 at the university campus. And on that plane that day were all kinds of notables, of course, Sergeant Shriver, and I think Stuart Udall might have been the Secretary of Interior. So Paul met John F. Kennedy when Paul was 19 years old and heard him speak. And within a year and a half, Paul's in the Peace Corps. Paul's in the second class of volunteers for the U.S. Peace Corps. His wife, Pat, was in the very first cohort of Peace Corps volunteers. She was working in the Philippines. He went to West Africa. He went to Ghana. At first to teach aeronautical stuff, but there's a twist in this. It turns out the head of the Air Force and air industry in Ghana happened to be Hitler's pilot. So that program did not last long. Once that fact was learned, Paul, meanwhile, begins to shift toward an interest in forestry. That had started in West Africa, but then he came back to the US and decided he wanted to go on in education and research. So he studied at the University of Michigan in the forestry program there, which was one of the leading programs in the country. And it turns out that he studied with this fellow, who most people will not know. Stephen Spur was one of the most important early forest ecologists. This textbook of his is, as far as I can ascertain, the first textbook in forest ecology, published in the 1950s. No, 1964. I had it wrong. First edition. So Paul was already oriented not toward pure production forestry, plantation forestry. He was oriented toward the forest as a living community, even in his graduate school years. It's then he met and eventually married. His wife, Pat, who I mentioned, had served in the Philippines, so they had an immediate bond through their Peace Corps shared experience. Paul returned to West Africa for further work in the communities. And this is important because, and this didn't occur to me until I was giving a talk recently, and someone asked the question, they asked, do you think Paul's service in Ghana helped orient him toward community-based approaches? I said, I really hadn't given it much direct thought, but that makes eminent sense. That this was all about working with the communities in Africa to establish their own community forests. But then Paul and Pat make a life decision. Decided, just short of getting his PhD, all he had to do was basically submit the manuscript of his dissertation. But he left graduate school, bought a farm outside Decorah, Iowa. Part of the Back to the Land movement of that time. And they began their farm and their family outside Decorah. Pat got a job teaching at Luther College. Paul stayed home, milked the cows and raised the kids. About 7 years later, Paul was basically drafted to run for the state legislature. Up in Northeast Iowa, they needed someone who would run on the Democratic side. Paul had not served in public office before, except as soil commissioner in Winneshiek County. In fact, he lost his first race for soil conservation district commissioner. But he went away on a hiking trip, said, you can put me on the ballot, but me and the family, we're going out to Montana. We're hiking this summer. He came back, he was on the ballot, and he ended up winning, surprising everybody, including himself. After he won, the head of the state house they had to call him and say, Paul, you won. And he had to call him and said, yeah, I know, you haven't called me yet. So he takes office. Notice the date. He's elected in 1984, which means he takes office in January 1985. What was going on in Iowa in 1985? Farm crisis. Paul takes office during the most difficult time for agriculture of the last several generations. And it's in the headlines again, not just in Iowa, but nationally. And Paul's very first piece, in fact, the very first piece we republish in this book is him writing home to his constituents about dealing with the farm crisis. And I'll pause there to say, especially for younger people, that's what I'm really enjoyed about how this book came together. It takes you from this moment in 1985, crisis not only in Iowa, but all through the country, but especially acute here in Iowa, all the way up to 2020, and climate change and biodiversity loss and all the modern issues that we're concerned with. So that arc is conveyed in the book through Paul's writings. There was another crisis coming to the surface, if you will, in Iowa, and that has to do with the groundwater. So already water quality issues were in the news. In this case, it's groundwater that Paul and many others were concerned about, contamination of groundwater, which is particularly difficult. Those of you who do work in environmental science, groundwater is hidden from us. It's especially difficult. We are still learning about how groundwater works. Back in the mid-'80s, we were just trying to respond to the crisis here in Iowa. So Paul, with several very important colleagues, many of whom are still with us. I've had a great time getting to know some of Paul's former colleagues. Gene Lloyd Jones down in Iowa City, Ralph Rosenberg, all these wonderful public servants who worked with Paul on passing this law in 1987, the groundwater bill, the Groundwater Protection Act, one of the most important pieces of legislation passed not only in Iowa, but this became a national model for other states wrestling with groundwater issues. If you're interested, there's a lot of information and some writing about the groundwater, but these are some of the key points of that legislation, setting standards and regs for dealing with the sources of contamination, well testing and plugging up wells that were no longer used, a lot of emphasis on public education, research, and I mentioned these three. Paul was always devoted to research and education and all the pieces of legislation he worked on. So they put provisions in here, create a center at the University of Iowa, Northern Iowa, and Iowa State, one for each of the three public universities. And I won't go into the details of these. Some people in this room may have been involved in some of these, but the one I'll highlight is the creation of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State in 1987. I don't know if it was the first center for sustainable agriculture. It may have been. Madison was a little bit behind. We came up with one shortly thereafter. But if you read through the legislation and the commentary on it, you find Paul saying this, and this really reflects that point about public education. The uniqueness of our act lies in its calling upon all Iowans to develop a conservation ethic through a host of programs in research, education, and demonstration. That phrase was very important to Paul. This wasn't just about passing a law. This was about developing a culture of caring for conservation. And in that, he was reflecting his growing appreciation of the legacy of Aldo Leopold. Paul, probably typically for his generation, had read Leopold's book, A Sand County Almanac, probably when he was in school in Michigan, because that's when it became a kind of a literary phenomenon around Earth Day in particular. But there was some particulars that were very interesting to look back on. And this is where it starts to intersect with my own story. In 1986, at Iowa State, there was a centennial celebration. Aldo Leopold was born in Burlington, Iowa. He's associated with Wisconsin and the Southwest, but he was born here in Burlington. So Iowa got aboard and organized this even before Leopold's centennial, which was in January 1987, held this conference, brought together all kinds of scholars and political figures, and resulted in this book that's still available. It's in its third or fourth edition now. So this served to highlight Leopold's legacy here in Iowa. But there's something more. I actually attended that, gave two of my very first academic presentations. I was nervous. I gave one talk, I thought it failed, and I gave a second talk, and it was on the theme of Leopold and agriculture. And this, to me, is, as I look back on it, one of the most important inflection points, not just because of me, but because of what was happening in Iowa. Leopold's legacy, which was global by this time, a lot of it had to do with his work on protecting wilderness. Leopold helped protect the very first wilderness area in New Mexico, 1924. Leopold's work on wildlife conservation. He had published the first textbook in wildlife in 1933. Leopold's contributions to ecology as it emerged as a science. This was what Leopold was known for. He was not recognized for his work on agriculture, except for a few key individuals, including a couple sitting right here in this room. But Leopold had spent decades working with farmers and ranchers. And his work at the University of Wisconsin was all about working with private lands and private landowners. Leopold wrote dozens of articles on everything from soil erosion to wildlife on the farm to soil ecology to even economics and sociology of rural life. So these are just a sample of the many pieces Leopold wrote. Remember Coon Valley? Back there, that early slide? Well, Leopold was devoted to thinking about watersheds and the health of watersheds. He'd done this work in the Southwest for the Forest Service, but when he got to the Midwest, it was very different. Because, why? The Forest Service owned whole watersheds. In Coon Valley, you had 500 farmers. You had to find a way of working with together. So that becomes an important early example of, again, community-based conservation. By the end of the 30s, Leopold had begun to meld all these themes together. When I gave that talk in Ames, I focused on this particular essay called The Farmer as a Conservationist, which had not seen the light of day since 1939. And it was one of the most beautiful things Leopold ever wrote. And it was republished finally in 1991. But in 1986, I brought this forward and gave a whole presentation about this. But here's what Leopold writes in that particular essay. The landscape of any farm is the owner's portrait of himself. It's the individual farmer who must weave the greater part of the rug on which America stands. Shall he weave into it only the sober yarns that warm the feet, or also some of the colors which warm the heart and eye? Paul read this, and I think every single speech he gave for the next 15, 20 years, he would use these lines. He loved this passage, and he committed it to his memory. He could pull it out at any moment. And I heard him many times in front of all kinds of different audiences invoke these words of Aldo Leopold. Paul goes on to do other things here in Iowa during his time as a legislator, including the Resource Enhancement and Protection Act, which continues to fund important conservation work all across Iowa. Another key interest of his is energy. Paul helps pass the Iowa Energy Act, calling for greater efficiency in energy sources. And now, as some of you may know this, his son Andy up in Winneshiek County created the Winneshiek Energy District to use that model of community-based soil conservation districts and applying it to the use of energy. Paul helping his son a little bit, but Andy did the bulk of that work. So it's 1987-88. Some of us will remember this. Some of this, you weren't born yet, but these are the years in which the concept of sustainability gains traction. The word had been around before. In 1987, the United Nations publishes Our Common Future, giving a definition of sustainability. Practical Farmers of Iowa is formed at the same time, taking this broad, fuzzy concept of sustainability and giving it roots and traction. I've always said this. I've always said it. Sustainability got its feet on the ground in Iowa in response to the farm crisis. You could not use the word sustainability in certain places in those days. You'd get into trouble. It was thought of as either too fuzzy to mean anything or too dangerous. And so we watched in those years a transition over just a couple years. Paul's work here in Iowa would put him on the national map. He was now known as a leading figure in the sustainable agriculture movement, particularly as a policymaker. So he was asked and invited to join the Board on Agriculture at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. He was the first farmer ever to serve on the Board of Agriculture of the National Academy of Sciences. And they began to publish a series of reports over the next few years. And this is when my story intersects, because I was working in this office and I helped write this one and this one and this one. This was the first, published, I think, 1988, 87, 88. Notice the word alternative. It's not sustainable agriculture. National Academy said, you're not going to use the word sustainable in the title. So they used that word. Within a couple years, it was on the title of all these reports. That was the transition that was happening in the late 80s, early 90s. And Paul was in the middle of it. And that also put him in a position to get noticed, especially after Bill Clinton was elected president, and they were looking for a new chief of the Soil Conservation Service, and Paul was tapped. So, and I love this statement here. When Paul Johnson, an Iowa farmer, former Democratic state legislator, and folk hero of the sustainable agriculture movement, this backhanded compliment, when he became chief of the Soil Conservation Service in 1993, he didn't have to travel far to learn why the once venerated agency was in deep trouble with farmers. All Johnson had to do was listen to his neighbors here in Iowa. So Paul enters into this leadership position, but he's highly aware of the history. And this is a hallmark of Paul's leadership and his work, his commitment to an awareness of history. He understood he was working in the shadows of others, most prominently perhaps Hugh Hammond Bennett, a name often forgotten now, and Paul devoted himself to bringing Bennett's name back. He was probably the most influential soil conservationist of the 20th century. In the USDA, in 1928, publishing this key document, Soil Erosion as a National Menace. Leopold knew him and worked with him. It was Bennett who chose Coon Valley for that first project. Out of the long list of nature's gifts to man, none is perhaps so utterly essential to human life as soil. Hugh Hammond Bennett. And in those years, of course, this was the crisis. This was the climate change of its time. Dust storms and soil erosion. It's not Coon Valley. That's the next watershed over. But it's essentially the same landscape. Here's Aldo Leopold in the 1930s thinking on this theme. We end at what might be called the standard paradox of the 20th century. Our tools are better than we are, grow better faster than we do, suffice to crack the atom, command the tides, but they don't suffice for the oldest task in human history, to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. Another quote Paul would often invoke. So how to heal over spoiled land becomes the heart of the movement in the 1930s and continuing on in the agency that Paul was now the head of. And the Soil Conservation Service, actually it started out as what was called the Soil Erosion Service, to SCS, and then to what is now the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And that change in the name of the agency actually happened under Paul's watch. So I actually did a whole lecture on what Paul did with the NRCS. If you're really into this theme, just stay a little late and I'll give you the link. They did record it. I gave a lecture online in January about Paul's time in the NRCS. This is a summary slide of what Paul was able to do in his 4 years in leadership role, seeing a transition in this agency, modernizing it, really diversifying the workforce, reinvigorating its mission, expanding its vision, all kinds of new farm bill conservation programs that had to be implemented, and Paul was there helping to do that. That's within the agency, but also beyond it, he was working in all kinds of different ways to reach outward from that agency, to work, for example, with the tribes. A lot of work in first time. Well, there's a whole story to the NRCS and its relationship with tribal communities, but Paul was one of the first to really take that on as a key part of his work. But above all, championing private lands conservation. And I mentioned this report earlier. Paul loved to get the story out. He really thought a lot about communication and how to reach citizens in appealing ways. So he called together a senior leadership and said, we need to produce a report on the importance of private land conservation. And it has to look good, and it has to be readable, and it has to be an appealing document. So they came up with this one, still available online. And this is the story behind that report. This is another thing Paul liked to do. When he was wanting to focus on a task, he'd do a retreat. When that was true when he was in the legislature, it was true later on. So here Paul says, I'm going to take all my senior leadership to the Leopold Shack in Wisconsin that has no running water, no electricity, and more mosquitoes than most people can bear. And for 3 days, they met outside Leopold's Shack and brainstormed about this report. And if you turned around, you would have seen, Laura, I include this, the second oldest prairie in the country that we know of, the shack at the Leopold Prairie at the Shack. Leopold had started the prairie, the Curtis Prairie, at the University Arboretum in Madison, and used those lessons to help restore the sand prairie. Here you see Paul invoking Leopold again. As we use our land, we paint our individual and community portraits on the land. Done well, those portraits can be a source of pride. Private land need not be devoted to single-purpose enterprise with a broader understanding of land and our place within the landscape. Our nation's farms, ranches, and private forests can and do serve the multiple functions that we and all other life depend on. So this is 1997. 30 years later, we're still struggling to figure out how to do this. But Paul had put these questions on the political map in a new way, and he got recognized for it by those who knew what was going on. This is Senator Harkin wishing Paul well on his retirement from being a chief. As a longtime farmer and conservation, these are from the Senate floor when Mr. Harkin got up to speak. Paul brought to the NRCS a bold vision of private lands as a national resource to be managed in harmony with the environment. Here's Al Gore appreciating Paul's work. Paul came back to Iowa. There's a tension in Paul's life between public service that took him away from the farm and his passion for being on the farm. And he was constantly battling this, and I've had many conversations with him. He served as the head of the DNR here in Iowa for almost 2 years. And then he left because it was a very recalcitrant legislature at that point, and nothing much was happening, and he just felt he was wasting his time. And I remember a conversation with Paul after he left this position. He says, I was visiting him, he said, Kurt, if I ever decide to do anything like that again, talk me out of it. So when he decided to run for Congress, I said, Paul, you told me. I said, you sure you want to do this? He says, yeah, somebody's got to step up. This is 2004. Paul felt the country was heading in a bad direction and that someone had to stand up. His chances of winning were pretty small, but he wanted to get the word out about the things he cared about. And notice his running. People often ask about Paul's politics. He ran as a, quote, independent Democrat. He was an unusual politician. He did not fit into categories. And so he liked to keep his independence even as he had to take on a party label. He also served with other organizations in his later years. He joined the board of the Aldo Leopold Foundation. He was on the board of the Land Institute also for a period of time. So Paul was finding other ways to provide leadership. Here's Paul with Aldo Leopold's children, Carl Leopold and Estella Leopold, at the shack again. And mostly Paul had time then to devote himself to his farm and his family, which he loved dearly, and to writing. You see a switch in Paul in his later years. He is beginning to write with a little more self-consciousness, a little self-awareness. He was always writing, reporting out, especially to constituents, right? But now later years, he's a little more reflective and really focusing on some of the most important themes that he wanted to put out there in the public arena. Now, just a couple quotes from the book just to highlight a few of those. I mentioned the importance of research, and here we are at UNI. I thought it would be important to include this. The purpose of research at our universities isn't simply to produce more jobs. It's more than that. Now more than ever, our research should be allowed to focus on public as well as private concerns, always looking toward the public interest. Again, that theme of multiple functioning farms. Iowa farmers could proudly show the world that they can contribute to reducing climate change while serving multiple functions rather than just growing corn and soybeans. I believe no agriculture is sustainable if it ignores the health of the natural ecosystem where it operates. It is fascinating to listen to Iowa politics right now. You see a real interesting, you know it better than I do, but I'm hearing things that I haven't heard for a long time, talking about the future of agriculture in Iowa. And it's going to be a very interesting year to watch. And then again, this theme of private lands conservation, saying it deserves an elevated position within mainstream conservation and environmentalism. The societal commitment separate and distinct from its current position as a stepchild within agribusiness-dominated farm policy. Paul was thinking big about how we could put into public policy fundamental changes in the way we regard private lands and their stewardship. This is in Paul's later years. He took one more, I think this is probably his last visit to the Leopold shack with his son, Eric. And he said, can you meet me up there? I'd just like to sit and relax. I said, absolutely, I'll drop everything. So we had a nice visit on that day. And now these organizations, I've worked with both of them, helped the Leopold Foundation for a long, long time, but Paul's family and friends here in Iowa mostly have also created what's called now the Johnson Center for Land Stewardship Policy. It's tiny, it has no employees. It's just a beginning point for beginning to carry on some of this work of Paul. So with that, I think I'm looking at the time and I don't want to go too long here. So I'll resist reading a little bit more, but I'll say what I was going to read had something more to do with Paul's integrity as a public official. Paul was, I mentioned, devoted to public service. And when he was in the state legislature, he took some hard votes that he knew his own constituents weren't going to agree with him on. So there's a wonderful piece in here in which Paul explains. It had to do with a bill to lower taxes. What politician wants to vote against a bill that would lower taxes? Paul voted against that bill, saying we have too many needs here and it would be wrong to do otherwise. That's why I voted against this bill. His daughter loves reading that because it shows a side of Paul that he was a pragmatist. He was always searching for the common ground with people who opposed him. But when it came to fundamental principles, you knew where his line was. So I'll leave it at that, but especially those of you who knew and worked with Paul a little bit, I'd really welcome you to share any thoughts you have if you'd like, but thank you. And I'll repeat the question if, yeah.
He's in the legislature, Iowa here, who's part of an environmental oriented group. And that group was instrumental in getting the Living Roadway Trust Fund developed. And that was a major part of the early parts of the Tallgrass Prairie.
I knew that before, but boy, it was so fun to come today and visit. And Laura showed me the map on the wall of the roadsides, and I just grooving on that because it really shows, yeah, what that cohort of leaders did back in the 1980s, and most younger people may not know about, but it really has had echo effects through the decades. And fortunately, a number of those elders are still with us and can tell that story. So invite them here to tell it. I said next year will be the 40th anniversary of that groundwater bill. And I spoke at a meeting of Iowa groundwater people, and I said, you need to invite these elders to come and tell the story of how hard it was to get that bill passed and the opposition they faced. Get them to tell that story because we need those stories more than ever. Other thoughts? Comments? Yes.
Obviously, Paul's USDA period overlapped with Senator Harkin, but it also overlapped with another farmer, Senator Grassley.
Ah.
I'm so curious, whether those two interacted, would they find common ground, or would they oil and water?
That's a great, yeah, the question was Paul's service in federal government overlapped with not only Senator Harkin, but with also Senator Grassley, who may have had a different view of things. That's a great question. I've never actually asked about Mr. Grassley. Paul I don't recall having any conversations with him, but I'm sure he did. And I know that there were people working in his office, in Grassley's office, that Paul did interact with, and apparently to a good effect. This is in the 90s. Politics were different then. Yeah.
Senator Grassley had a hand in TPC.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I'll mention, it reminds me of another theme that I didn't mention, and that is Paul's impact as a mentor to people in elected office. You know, Mr. Vilsack didn't have a farming background, didn't know much about, apparently. This is all secondhand. This is being recorded. I apologize in advance if I say it wrong, but I think Vilsack himself has said, Paul Johnson pretty much taught me what I know about soil and water conservation and land conservation. And there's others. Our congressman up in western Wisconsin, where Coon Valley is. He didn't know the story of Coon Valley. It's in his own legislative district, and he didn't know the story. Paul told him why the land he represents, why it has such an important story to tell. So there's many people who, here's one for you if you get a campaign event here. Rob Sand, running for governor right now. He worked on that 2004 campaign for Paul Johnson for Congress because he was from Decorah. So you might ask him, did you learn any lessons from Paul Johnson? See what he says. So Paul had this effect on people in elected office where he was helping teach them about especially the history of conservation here in Iowa and beyond. Dr. Jackson.
little while apart here. And Wendell Berry began settling America. Chapter 12. We have the critique of a state that agriculture would be for a product of well, what eventually became the industrialization of agriculture instead of Jefferson's view of what the role would have been for humans on the landscape with one another, engaged instead of the ball. I wondered, could that have been possible? Could it have been possible had there been, instead of the art of agriculture, developing the approach of efficiency and the usual state of industrialization? And I wondered, would it even be worthwhile to have a discussion on that issue? Are they right now that we have more young people that are going back to the land, that they're going back to the land in smaller chunks, northeast, not much out of our way of Kansas. But is that something that has the fossil fuels go down to get more of the Jeffersonian idea?
I don't know if I can repeat that question, because there's no way you can paraphrase Wes Jackson. All you can do is try to wrap your head around it. For those on Zoom, Wes was asking about the big picture of industrialized agriculture that we are now in the grips of, and is there a different path forward? And people in this room have done as much as anyone to help create that path forward. But here's where my head went with your question, Wes. Paul was a pragmatist. Paul wanted to see stuff done on the land. He wanted to make a difference in the relatively short term. And he was a visionary too, in this tension in his life between his visionary side and his pragmatic side. It's another tension in his life that he had to deal with, especially as an elected official. But one of the other things that cohort of legislators did back in Iowa in the 80s was change the name of the Department of Agriculture to Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, which may seem just symbolic, but sometimes symbols help us chart the path and at least open up the conversation. Paul, Wes, you also mentioned younger people getting in it. It's increasingly hard for younger people to even get a place to start living out their own hopes and dreams, although you see it happening here and there, and especially in our region where I live in Wisconsin, it's relatively easier than it is in the middle of Iowa, for example. So if you're not doing anything the next few days, come over to Dubuque for the Savannah Institute's Perennial Farm Gathering. Next 3 days, we'll be going over, a bunch of us, and you will see the most enthusiastic group of mostly younger people trying out new techniques and practices, trying to make it work through perennializing agriculture for this region, just as in Kansas, the Land Institute has worked there. So that's an inadequate answer to a very large question, which we will pursue over dinner and drinks, I hope. And I know we're getting short on time, and you've got a couple more slides. I don't want to cut anything short, but I really appreciate your interest. And if you are interested in the book, again, there's some copies out there, and cookies. And the last thing I'll say is this book, even though Paul had a national constituency in a sense, this very much is an Iowa story. And I've been spending more time in Iowa giving talks than I have in Wisconsin for the last 6 months. And I've really appreciated dipping back into Iowa, especially at this really challenging, interesting time the state is in. So I hope this will contribute. And it's the last thought, because now I remember the critique of agriculture that Wes mentioned. There's a lot of books out, new books out this right now on corporate consolidation and commodification over the last 70, all the trends that we have watched. There's at least a dozen new books out on this in the last 3 or 4 years. This is different. Paul's book is a little bit about, well, here's an example of one person who did his best in his own way, in his own life, to address that in a pragmatic way. So I encourage you to pick up these other books. It's really, I've had a chance to be together with some of those authors, and it's really keeping me buoyant these days that are so difficult. So.
All right. Kurt, thank you so much for your wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Kurt, that wonderful talk. Just a couple things to say to wrap things up. This is a part of a series of events, and our next one is on March 23rd. We start a series of prairie walks at Irvin Prairie, which is near Dysart in Benton County, and you're all welcome to join us for those. There's more information on our website, and we'll be having some guests throughout the summer to help us celebrate that prairie and enjoy it together. And then our next and final seminar is a celebration of a wonderful film that Daryl Smith was very much involved in creating, called America's Lost Landscape, the Tallgrass Prairie. And this film was shown nationwide on PBS many times. It's a gorgeous film, and it holds up very well for something that was done in 2002. It holds up extremely well. And after that, after screening that film, we have a panel of Prairie Panthers, Daryl Smith, and then 3 students who graduated in different eras that all involved in Prairie at UNI, which has been around here since 1973. So we're celebrating UNI's 150th anniversary with a celebration of Prairie at UNI with this screening of the film and this panel presentation. So please come to that and tell your friends about it. And then we will be having a summer open house at the Tallgrass Prairie Center sometime in June. We haven't quite decided that yet, but there will be more information on our website. So that's all we have. Thank you so much, and come again.